All right, well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm sure that it's a very busy and kind of stressful week for everyone, so we really appreciate you taking the time. We're going to sit here with Ayo Awokoya and do our virtual, she's going to have a presentation for us. But just a quick introduction. She is a British journalist. She's based in London. She has written and worked for the GQ, the Financial Times, Sky News, and the Guardian's Long Read. In 2019, she received the inaugural Jamal Khashoggi Award for Courageous Journalism. And so I know that a couple of you, or a few of you at this point, should know a little bit about the Pulitzer Center. But for anyone joining us for the first time who might not know, I just wanted to provide a very quick overview of who I am and who the Pulitzer Center is. So I'm actually doing an internship at the Pulitzer Center. I'm their education intern for the fall. And so what you all probably already know about the Pulitzer Center is that we focus on something called underreported stories. And so these are news stories that are really important, but they're not really getting as much attention, the attention that they deserve, and they actually often take more time to tell. What we do is we give grants to journalists to go and work on these stories worldwide. And so often these are global issues. And so they affect many places and many people. And so we might not know a lot about these issues. So this way, the journalists can really do some important work and help inform us. So I'm really excited today to introduce Ayo. And if you have any questions throughout the presentation, I'm excited to go ahead and hand it over to her.
Great. Okay, so I've got a presentation of my own that I can share with the entire class now. Let's see. Right, can you all see it? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thank you for that introduction, Mary. I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to essentially be walking you through the investigation that I did alongside a colleague called Tobias Jones, who also received a Pulitzer grant for this project. And just to kind of talk you through a little bit about the reporting process and the research that I conducted that helped me gather the intel that I needed in order to make the story stand up. But just a little bit before that, I'm just going to go very briefly into my background as a journalist. So why did I decide to become a journalist? Essentially, I was wary and pretty conscious of the fact that my community in Britain, so I'm originally from Nigeria, so I belong to the Black African community here. I felt that the way my community in particular wasn't portrayed with enough nuance or a right amount of accuracy in a lot of newspapers and magazines, and I decided to become a journalist in order to try and change a bit of the narrative from my perspective. Oh, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah,
perfect. I'm just hearing a little bit of interference. So that was one of the reasons I primarily decided to become a journalist. And then so my background in terms as a freelance journalist, I've been doing that for the past 5 years. And then I only started to work on investigative projects for the past 2 years. This is a bit of an old presentation. So for the last 2 years, I've been focusing on investigative projects. And I didn't actually have a traditional background in journalism. I didn't go to school. I didn't go to university to study journalism. I actually did international relations at Nottingham University. I received a master's in that, and then did a number of internships. I think I did a number of free, and they range between a month to 3 months. And then I decided actually to go freelance and pursue the project that I'm going to discuss with you now. And getting that published very much cemented the kind of areas that I wanted to go into as a journalist, and it kind of very much reflects my own portfolio. And so the kind of ins and outs of being a journalist range from day to day. Sometimes I could be having multiple phone calls with people ranging from politicians, so MPs who are like members of parliament. It could be to academics, it could be to lawyers who might have some background to share on the topic that I'm looking into. And sometimes maybe I'll go over to see a source, either in a public area like a park. Sometimes I might go over to their house, permitting security checks done, and I feel comfortable going over to a source's house. Sometimes it can be that I'm writing the particular piece or a pitch, or I'm liaising with editors about what next steps to take in my over reporting. So the everyday there is no everyday of kind of routine of being a journalist. It can range from various different ways, and it's a really exciting field to be in if you are interested in talking to people, if you're interested in research. It's a really varied area where you can kind of put stories out there that feel relevant and important to you, through a bunch of different mediums like radio or print or podcasting or broadcast. And so this is a not very good map, but a map that I managed to find online, kind of detailing a bit of the background to the migrants' routes from parts of sub-Saharan Africa to Libya, which was the main kind of epicenter for taking migrants across the Mediterranean to parts of Europe. So from here, you can see on this map that some migrants come from East Africa, such as Somalia or Ethiopia, and travel across in various different ways to make their way to Libya and to get to the coast. Some come from Nigeria or Ghana, or other parts of West Africa. And in that particular journey, most of the time, a lot of the migrants had to go through the Western Sahara in order to get to Libya. So the journeys that a lot of these migrants made were extremely perilous. They were dangerous. A lot of them, unfortunately, didn't necessarily make it to Libya, just because of the range of different dangers and challenges that they had to go through on the way there. So once a lot of migrants made their way to Libya, they traveled up to the coast, and from there they managed to acquire access to boats that would take them over, mainly to Italy, but sometimes Greece or other parts of southern Europe that were seen to be more easily accessible. In some cases, actually, some migrants also make it to England, across the English Channel as well. The various routes that they take are quite complex, but the dangers that they experience cannot be understated. They were very much coming from a place of desperation, and the reasons as to why a lot of these migrants undertook these journeys range from: some were fleeing from persecution, some from really terrible economic circumstances, some for a better quality of life. There are all various different reasons why a lot of these migrants made the journey over, and a lot of them were quite complex, but they decided that for them, traveling through this route was the best possible chance of having a better life. So for me, the main question that I was looking into as a journalist when I was researching this topic was what actually happens to African migrants once they cross the Mediterranean and enter Italy. And behind here is a kind of picture here showing like the state of the boats that they went into. Most of the time they were overpopulated. Very few of them have access to, the safety precautions, to life jackets. And sometimes in a lot of cases, a lot of these boats overflow. A lot of these boats actually capsized because of the amount of water that was coming in. Sometimes the engines didn't work, and they were stranded. And sometimes they were able to call the Coast Guard to come rescue them. But as we unfortunately know, a lot of migrants didn't make it when they crossed the Mediterranean. So my main question is, what does happen when they do kind of make it over the perilous journey into Italy? And so the question that I arrived at, and my colleague also arrived at around the same time, was a lot of African migrants, once they do make it to Italy and they do apply for asylum, which is the kind of political and legal process to get granted a certain level of rights and protections, such as a right to work, a right to live in certain places. Once they apply for that system, once they get into Italy, they actually ended up being in a sort of limbo, because the process to get asylum, depending on why you're applying for asylum, can be various different reasons. That process could take something between 6 months to 3 to 4 years. And during that time, a lot of migrants actually didn't have any political or legal protections enforced by the Italian state. And so in order to work, in order to survive, a lot of them ended up working on tomato fields. Now, the experience of these migrants working on the tomato fields, we discovered, was paramount to slavery. Essentially, the working conditions were extraordinarily low. They were very hazardous. A lot of migrants ended up having to work for 12 hours a day, with very little access to food or water, low access to sanitation. Essentially, a lot of these migrants had to pick, very small plum tomatoes and fill them up in crates that I would say be 100 times the size you're looking at now. And for every crate that they filled, they were paid the equivalent, I think, of $2.50. I know in Europe, in Italy specifically, they go in Europe and they go into kind of cents. So I'm trying to think of the currency, but it would be an extremely low amount of money in dollars, I imagine, as well. And essentially the experience of doing that, the amount of physical effort and labor was so exhausting that quite a few migrants died in the process on the fields because they were worked physically to the bone. They didn't have access to healthcare whilst they were doing this type of work. And it was extremely dangerous. And because the exploitation was so high, we, based on all the findings and the recordings we had with migrants who were willing to speak to us, we discovered that all of the evidence showed that this was a form of modern day slavery that exploits the vulnerabilities of migrants who have no place to go, who have no other way other than to be heavily exploited to make some kind of a living. And so when I obviously explained before about the low cost of pay, that also then translated into the migrants' inability to find, access to a good place to live. So this is kind of a picture showing like the kind of communities the migrants did end up having to create for themselves. And obviously you can see these are equivalent to shanty towns. You can see here that a lot of the infrastructure is extremely poor. It's wood, anything they could find to create some sort of infrastructure or housing that was essentially was used. Sometimes I would see mattresses being propped up as a wall, as part of a ceiling. Sometimes it would be rocks or stone that they could find and build. And so you can see that the conditions that they live are extremely deprived, and often a lot of the time these infrastructures were prone to be setting on fire because of the kind of dry land in which they had built all these houses upon. And sometimes because they also create access to electricity, there would also be so many different fires that would spread and kind of destroy all these communities that they managed to build. So you can understand that out of a lot of desperation, these migrants were forced to live in really horrible living conditions. But however, one thing we did discover when we did go around to these different communities, there was a high level of ingenuity. A lot of these communities ended up having restaurants and shops and clubs, and a different kind of small community did gather in a lot of creative and really impressive ways. They had access to Wi-Fi, they had access to electricity. They didn't have access to basic sanitation, I will say, like bathrooms and toilets didn't really exist. They were mainly holes in the ground. Oftentimes there were a few women who also did live that had issues trying to get access to own sanitations with periods and everything like that. So it was an extremely tough living conditions, and that was primarily a result of the direct slavery that they found themselves exploited by. So this is also another picture of one of the communities that we managed to cover when we were doing our reporting. And again, you can kind of see the poor living conditions, but then you can see a bit more about the way in which they tried to establish a sense of community. So the reporting process in its entirety took about 14 months from the inception of the project to the publication. And so initially for me, I was based in the UK when I was starting this project, and I actually was inspired by another investigative piece that CNN did on slave auctions in Libya. And they essentially uncovered that a lot of African migrants who were based in Libya were unfolded into slave auctions and sold on the black market for their physical labor. And essentially there was a really similar pattern where a lot of trafficking routes come from Libya and are basically extend over to other parts of Europe, especially with sex trafficking. So then that kind of implanted the idea in my mind where if there are slave labor conditions in Libya, there's primary trafficking routes, is there a possibility that African migrants could be trafficked for the purpose of labor in places like Italy or Greece? So to better verify my own thesis, so with every investigation, you have a particular thesis that you're trying to prove through data, evidence, documentation. So the basis of my investigative thesis was, is the slave practice happening? How does it work? Who's involved? What institutions are looking away? And in order for me to verify all of that, I spent 6 months making phone calls to various NGOs and lawyers, both some based in Libya, some based in Italy, some based in the UK, who had quite strong links to the situation that was happening in southern Italy. And then, so after about a 6-month period, when I talked to, I think, about 25 plus people, I was managed to ascertain that there were slave labor practices happening in Italy, but that was primarily as a result of various institutional failures, the kind of discrimination that a lot of African migrants faced when they got there. All of that kind of unfolded into a system where slave labor practices were happening. And then, so when I discovered that, I then decided off my own back to go to southern Italy to prove through my reporting. So speaking to a number of the migrants who were there, who were experiencing this level of exploitation, from their views, what was happening, and getting all the recordings down, finding more documentation by speaking to Italian lawyers as to what was happening, going to an NGO called Anti-Slavery International to support, to verify to them, like, this is my findings, does this match up with your own data? And then they said that it very much fell into their understanding of what constituted modern day slavery. So the reason why I ended up going there on my own was I did actually approach the Guardian long read with my findings initially before I went out there, and they were quite wary of essentially commissioning the story on the basis that I hadn't seen it for myself. There was concerns of the danger involved. They also didn't want me to send. They also didn't want to send me to Libya to verify, because obviously Libya has it's kind of engulfed in a civil war at the moment. There's a lot of volatile fighting. It's very unstable, and so many journalists actually have now been barred from coming into Libya due to the significance of the violence that's ongoing at the moment. So there are various different reasons why my editors were wary of, taking on the piece straight away. So I felt very strongly about this story, and I decided, with the money that I had, to go and verify for myself that it was happening. Once I was confident with the material that I had, I then went back to the Guardian long read and showed them my findings, and they were actually happy to take on the piece. And actually another reporter they worked with also cited similar findings. And so we worked together for the next 6 to 8 months, traveling to different parts of southern Italy to further verify and ascertain our findings. So that was one of the main challenges that I faced. Another one was the kind of safety of being a female reporter on the field, where many different communities will have different views on how a woman should conduct herself socially. So I ended up having to overcome that by building a very good rapport with a lot of the migrants who knew I was a journalist, knew what I was trying to do, what I was trying to uncover. And I essentially went in with someone I trusted every time. I spoke to them very regularly about the different culture that existed in these communities with African migrants. How do I best navigate them? And so just by learning on the go about how to conduct myself and when I should go into these areas, when I should not, often at night was quite a dangerous period of going in, because there was a lot of violence and unrest there, because a lot of these communities, there were elements of criminality as well. So oftentimes it was mostly safe to go in during the day at a certain point. And a lot of these migrants ended up recommending me for people to talk to. So there was a level of vetting also going on at the same time. And there were just, you won't necessarily understand the challenges that come in your reporting until you face them head on. And sometimes there were issues with translation, because a number of these migrants come from all across Africa. So in West Africa, mostly a lot of these migrants spoke French, some spoke English. And so that was, and quite a few of them spoke Italian. So there was also the need to have translators involved, and, negotiating how that would be done, and, making sure you were being very forthcoming about the fact you were a journalist as well, because there have been instances with some of my colleagues in the past where there was confusion as to who they were. That caused a lot of suspicion in the community. And sometimes they felt they were in danger as a result of a level of miscommunication about if they were a journalist or not. So I made it very clear the fact that I was a journalist, and I told them exactly what I was hoping to achieve by coming into their communities and talking to people. And so I think the main takeaway I had from this project was, if you truly do believe in a story you care about, it's worth pursuing, even if you get pushback from editors, pushback from, I mean, sometimes there is pushback because of safety regulations, and that's definitely something to consider. And the risk was definitely on I calculated the risk and decided to go on and pursue the project, very much also taking every safety precaution that I could. But if there is a story where you feel like should be told, that you very firmly believe can change the way people think, that is something that I think is paramount in the mind of every journalist when they decide to venture on a project that may come into a lot of challenges or a lot of pitfalls. It's the kind of determination and tenacity that's very much needed as a part of this job, because you are very much dealing with people. You're dealing with people who have various different, feelings and opinions about a certain subject. You may push back because they don't agree with, or they're not really receptive to the reporting you're doing. And in investigative journalism, that's always going to be the case when you're trying to get institutions and individuals, and sometimes governments or politicians, when you're trying to hold them to account, you will face pushback. So it's always really important that you believe in the story you're trying to tell. And then this is just a kind of a bit of like what you can do in regards to instances of like either slave labor practices or high level of exploitation in your own regions. I know this would be more applicable to like Mexico or other parts of Central and Southern America, than obviously with Italy and Europe. But often if you do feel that this is a particular topic that you feel you want to kind of learn more about, or you want to kind of avoid affecting, migrants or workers in a different country, but you're buying produce that's directly exported from that country. Sometimes the best thing you can do is kind of look at the labels of the fruit and veg you buy, do some research to see if the areas or the regions where your fruit is being exported from, do they have labor problems? Do they have historical labor problems? Have there been instances uncovered by the press that show people being exploited as a result of consumer practices, of what we buy? And if that's the case, I would also suggest it's best to buy locally produced, ethically sourced food from within America. Or if you're struggling with it, it's also good to talk to an adult, such as a teacher or a parent, and having these conversations about what you can best do to mitigate these certain circumstances. And then also pricing can also be kind of an indicator. So if something is particularly cheap, there's probably a reason as to why that might be. With tin tomatoes in Europe and in the UK, they are extremely cheap. And that was one of the reasons why so many people would buy them. But the reason why it's cheap is because, a lot of communities who pick the fruit and vegetable we buy end up suffering really horrendous conditions as a result, because they're paid unfairly or exploited very severely. And yeah, that's kind of the end of my presentation. So I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have about my reporting or the research process.
Great, thank you so much. I'm sure I definitely learned so much from this presentation. So I'm sure everyone else did as well. It looks like we have maybe a little over 10 minutes. So I'll go ahead and jump into some of the things I'm seeing in the chat. And then those of you joining virtually, please feel free to keep adding your questions. So Mr. Coleman is asking, how do you decide, and I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, how do you decide what part of this huge story to tell as a journalist? And how do you find underreported stories that are a part of bigger stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. So sometimes actually I found stories by looking through newspaper articles, and often there's just one slip of information that you think, oh, that's quite interesting. It hasn't been explained more. Why don't I look into that by making a phone call to this lawyer that said a certain thing that I think deserves deeper questioning or deeper investigation. Other times it will come about through a source or just someone I'm speaking to saying something very particular. On the current investigation I'm doing now, actually it came about because there was a huge media storm around this model who was receiving a lot of harassment online. And it was the circumstances in which that occurred were very particular. So then I decided to ask more questions to online activists in the trans community, because the model in itself she's a trans model. And then they revealed a bigger pitch to me as to what was happening and the kind of targeted attacks on members of the trans community. And so sometimes that is another way in which you can get deeper stories, by finding snippets that you find suspicious or you think deserves deeper questioning. With the Italy story, that came about, like I said, with the CNN investigative expose, because it made me question, okay, there might be something more, there might be a bigger picture that we're not seeing. So, and oftentimes it's a level of critical thinking that you need, and just asking questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions of information. Don't necessarily take everything you see for granted. If there's something that you think deserves to be told in a much broader or deeper aspect, then that's a great line of questioning to go down.
Thank you. We have another question. Why do you like print journalism instead of audio, video, or pictures?
That's a good point. I am going to be very blunt. I don't like being on TV. Radio journalism is actually quite fun, and podcasting is quite fun. But I think primarily print journalism, I really care about the way words affect people and the kind of way it can change hearts and minds. And I feel it's a very powerful means of journalism, even though obviously print journalism is going through a very tough time at the moment. Also because I feel very strongly that the best way for me to tell stories is through writing and the power of words. And I feel like there's just a lot more room as a long form investigative journalism to tell stories in a lot more depth. But every different medium of journalism, whether that's audio or broadcasting, has a really deep impact in the way people resonate with stories. Some people prefer to listen to journalists and speak about their reporting. Some people like to watch documentaries. And they're all really important ways of telling a story, or really powerful ways of telling a story. And so it really does come down to individual preference. It comes down to you being affected by stories in a particular medium. So for me, 2 stories, one by the New York Times Magazine and one by GQ, really resonated with me. They were 2 long form pieces, and it was just a moment for me where I was like, that's the kind of journalism I want to do. It's just being inspired by a particular medium, I can see myself doing that. This is what I want to do, and I want to get to the level that I've just seen. So that was kind of what made me go into that particular avenue.
Great, thank you for sharing. And I also like that point you made earlier too about wanting to be able to tell a story that could actually change someone else's mind. That's a very good point. So Tyler's asking the question, which kind of you kind of answered that in your last question about print journalism, but what made you want to become an investigative journalist? What started that?
That's quite interesting, because I actually thought I would become a foreign correspondent. Okay, that's how it happened. So I kind of, in a way, kind of fell into it. It was more about investigative journalism chose me rather than the other way around, if that makes sense. I, with the Italian project, just saw a story that I felt very passionate about. I knew it was more of an investigative story through and through, but essentially it was just like something like, this is wrong to me, that the world doesn't know that this is happening on this scale. It's something that I just felt a particular passion and calling towards, and just went for it. So for me, becoming investigative journalism very much was a decision made on a particular feeling that I felt it was the right thing to do, and this is the right way to go about it. And I think that's kind of the same for a lot of investigative journalists. It's more about you get confronted with a particular situation and you decide there and there, like, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to investigate deeper because this needs to be told, rather than something you kind of dream about as a kid. It's a very particular form of journalism to get into because it's very difficult and there are loads of pitfalls and challenges. But when you really get to the point where you find the bigger picture and you find the deeper meaning behind a certain incident, it is like a completely revelatory feeling that I think is quite irreplaceable. And it's just really worth pursuing if you feel like there is a lot of injustice around a certain incident, around a certain community, if you feel like there is something that just hasn't been told and it's unfair, or you deeply feel that institutions or individuals or governments aren't being held accountable. Investigative journalism is probably one of the few ways in which that can happen, primarily for the public interest.
Great, thank you. And that kind of gets into this next question that we have, which is, how do you balance objective journalism with meaningful social justice reporting? Mm-hmm. And how do you pursue an angle or perspective while protecting yourself from being accused of bias or personal interest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really complicated question. That's the conversations we're having now in the industry about what is objectivity. It's really difficult because a lot of investigative journalism, a lot of investigative journalists do feel that they are, in a way, it's about social justice primarily, and that's why they pursue the things that they do. I think the best way to kind of combat instances of bias is to always be questioning yourself and the evidence you get and the information you get from your sources. So one source could say one thing and you could believe them in that instance, but you then have to go back and be like, can I support what they're saying by evidence, where it's documentation, where it's been corroborated, so whether several different people have said the same thing. And there are other ways you can obviously corroborate evidence and to cement what someone said, but if that kind of falls through and you can't find anything, it is much better for you then to rethink your investigative thesis, what you think this investigation is. And if you go in with that mindset of just constantly questioning and constantly trying to ascertain that your findings are correct through really cold, hard evidence, that is the best way to put in objectivity with the kind of social justice mission that investigative journalists have. And it is a tough line, but I mean, with the kind of super objective, I mean, every journalist has biases based on your own, social upbringing, based on what views you have. It's an inevitability, but the best way to do your work and to kind of push back against those biases is to just have the evidence you need with your investigative findings, to never publish without verifying or confirming without a shadow of doubt, or to the best of your ability that what you're saying is true. And your editors and your fact checkers definitely help you with that. But as a reporter, it's just much better to discipline yourself in that mindset, and rather trying not to follow your feelings trying to follow your mind rather than the feelings you have towards a particular project also can help. But it is extremely difficult when you're seeing the magnitude of suffering of a particular community or of a particular issue, and you want to get the truth out there, but you have to be very thorough in the way you conduct it.
And the reporting in Italy, here's asking, how long has this been going on for? I guess the issue in Italy of modern slavery.
I believe it's been decades actually. So I think in the past, because I mean the route from Libya to Italy and Greece and other parts of Southern Europe has been an ongoing thing. When Gaddafi was still in charge of Libya and even prior, it only really became more of in the attention of media as a migration crisis after the fall of Gaddafi and after Libya kind of fell into a civil war. Then it became way more pronounced because of the amount of instability it caused, the amount of refugees who wanted to venture into Europe, and the level of trafficking just reached a sky-high level. And then so in regards to that, it's with the situation with the exploitation in Italy, I know I spoke to someone who managed to get himself out and really settle down in Italian society, and he got married, and he at the time, I'm pretty sure, was in his 50s, and he said 30 years ago I came to this country and it was exactly the same as it is now. So that kind of gives you a bit of context as to how long ago. So I would say about between 30 to 50 years, I think that situation's been going on for.
And I know we only have a few minutes left, so I do want to ask a couple questions. We seem to have a more technical question about your writing and how do you use words to impact your readers, and how do you write in a way that explains the topic the best?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really difficult process because you don't want to be too technical that puts your puts your readers off, or makes it inaccessible, so not easy to read. And oftentimes I try to focus on the individual stories and the impact, just showing a very story that happened to one individual that shows the wider implications of a particular topic. That's one way in which I do it, but in terms of the actual structure, that's also very difficult. It depends on the outlet, on their writing style. It depends on like how long the piece is. If it's with the Guardian long read, it was a 10,000 word piece, so it's the size of a dissertation. It was very long, and so we then had to then struggle to figure out what was the best way of telling the story in a way that would constantly engage the reader and make them understand like the various different nuances and technicalities of how this particular event transpired. It takes a lot of research and it takes a lot of time to figure out what's the most important things. There was so much in that story we couldn't put in. It would probably be a book if we, put all our findings together. So it's also trying to find out what is the most important thing that the reader needs to know in this instance, and that they might be able to, if they're more interested, they can learn later on if they do more research. And so those are the kind of questions you need to ask yourself in the reporting process, in the writing process. And it does take a lot of time. I think we went through 13 rewrites of the 10,000 word piece, and that took about 3-4 months. So that was with constant editing, and then fact checking that came with it.
13. Great, thank you. And I think you just kind of answered our last question. But just to kind of close, we do have one question from Tyler. Tyler wants to know if there's a writer that made you want to become an investigative journalist. And I guess in answering that, to close out, are there any lasting thoughts you have that you'd like to leave with the class?
So the investigative journalist that I really admired was Azmat Khan. She's a freelancer as well, actually. She wrote a piece with Anand Gopal for the New York Times on drone strikes in, I believe it was Iraq. And that was a very long piece. I think that was like 12,000 words. But that, because they managed to focus on the story of one man whose entire life was upended because of a drone strike that killed the majority of his family, his home. And then weaved it in with their investigative findings of how much the US drone strikes have affected Iraq and the Middle Eastern region in particular, I think was the most inspiring thing for me as to the way these stories can be told and the way investigative journalism has evolved since 20 years ago, when it can be told in a kind of very straight reportery way that in some cases wasn't as engaging as it could be. And then I suppose the last kind of words I would just say, investigative journalism now with the current climate is more important than ever. It's more important to kind of show people that it's not as daunting as you think it can be. Because I thought that when I thought about investigative journalism, that it was only a very high-minded career path that only certain people could go down. And that's a form of gatekeeping. It's not true. There are so many people who do investigative journalism every day in incredible ways, and it can go from investigative journalism in the music industry to slave labor practices to government corruption to just almost anything can be a form of investigative journalism. So I would just, if you are interested in that specific field, I would encourage all of you to please don't give up on it, and to not be intimidated by thinking it's harder. It is really hard, but not in a way that would obscure you from being able to do it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I've just learned so much, and you were just so thorough in your presentation with just your reporting and everything that's driving your reporting. And so I'm sure that all students and teachers joining also really appreciate it. So Mr. Coleman, if you have any, I guess we can go ahead and close out, but I really appreciate everyone for joining us today.
Right. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for joining us. This was awesome. I'm a combination of incredibly impressed and outraged in the story. Yeah. Like, this is like Italy. This is like some of those pictures. Like, I don't know how it would be hard for me to not be like, why is this going on? Like,
yeah, that was my response immediately. And there were so many, I think there were about 10 of those scattered around that small region. And it also was like in, you know, other produce was involved. It wasn't just tomatoes, it was like olives and oranges. So it's a really common practice in that part of Italy. And then the Italian mafia were also involved as well. And there was just a lot going on. So it really was a really harrowing issue.
well, thank you very much for that incredible work and dangerous work that you're doing.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate you joining us. We do have to move on and do our regular daily work. Thank you so much for doing this. And can we all say thank you? Or
Thank you so much.
Thank you.